Soren didn't look at the celestial maps. Instead, he pressed his thumb against the edge of the obsidian table, measuring the heat of the stone. He glanced toward the ceiling, his eyes following the blue glow of the ventilation shafts for 3 full seconds before returning to his hands. The Grand Archive is a temple of silence. I am Keeper Vash, and for 300 years, I have curated the unbroken lines of galactic history. Every species we encounter is a single, fragile thread. If that thread snaps, the record ends. There are no second acts in biology. We categorize candidates by their stability, ensuring that their evolutionary path was free from the catastrophic disruptions that turn planets into tombs. The light in the chamber is always soft, designed to preserve the physical scrolls and the digital nodes alike. Soren leaned back, ignoring the towering spires of data. Listen closely to the Blacksmith. I issue this warning because the truth about Earth is a fire that will scorch your understanding of life itself. I activated the historical projection, but the light stuttered. The data for Earth didn't flow into the usual smooth, chronological spiral. Fractured. It looked like a broken transmission, or perhaps my internal processors were failing to sync, as the timeline displayed jagged gaps where centuries of data should have been. My console pulsed red. It was a partial record, missing the connective tissue that defined every other civilization in the Fanashi registry. There's a corruption in your file, I said, tapping the interface. It's not a corruption, Soren replied. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, red apple. He didn't ask for permission to eat in the hall. Continuity is a luxury we never had. You're looking for a bridge where we only have scars. He held the fruit up to the light, inspecting its skin for bruises with the same intensity he had used on the ventilation shafts. In the civilized galaxy, a single asteroid strike of sufficient mass is the functional end of a species' story. If a planet's atmosphere turns to acid for even a decade, the biological chain dissolves, leaving nothing but fossils for the next billion years to ignore. We teach our students that sentience is a narrow window that only stays open under perfect conditions, and any breath of celestial wind can blow it shut forever. Soren took a loud, wet bite of his snack, the sound vibrating through the acoustic dampeners of the archive with the force of a hammer strike. We noted your planet's tectonic activity, I continued, trying to ignore the scent of sugar and enzymes now filling the room. We assume your ancestors were fortunate to evade the worst of it. A minor volcanic winter, perhaps, but nothing that broke the lineage. Soren chewed slowly, his eyes fixed on a specific hairline crack in the floor. Fortunate isn't the word I'd use, Soren said. He gestured to the flickering hologram of Earth's timeline with a hand that had spent decades wrestling iron into shape. That gap you're seeing around the 250 million year mark? That wasn't a minor winter. That was the Great Dying. The oceans boiled, the air turned to poison, and nearly 96% of all life on the planet simply stopped breathing. My world didn't just stumble. It was hollowed out. But life on Earth doesn't know how to quit a fight once the bell rings. I stared at the data. A mass extinction of that scale was a statistical finality. How did you survive the Great Dying? I asked. We didn't, Soren said. We're the things that came after, but that gap is only one piece of the puzzle. The historical projection on the obsidian wall flickered as I tried to force the bridge between Earth's fractured eras. I assumed a planetary reset was a failure of biology, a sign of a world too weak to protect its own. In the Fanashi mind, a break in the chain meant the end of the story. 5 separate graveyards became the foundation for one set of lungs. Soren carefully wiped the sticky residue from his iron blade onto his rough trousers. He looked at the half-eaten fruit, then back at the red emergency strobes now pulsing against the obsidian walls. The archive was screaming. The core logic processors were melting their own gates as they tried to reconcile a biosphere that treated global suicide like a routine shift at the coal furnace. Junior archivist Elu, only 19 cycles into her first assignment, stood paralyzed while her secondary respiratory vents flared a desperate, jagged violet. She had spent her youth learning that history was a glass bridge. Yet here was a man whose ancestors had used planetary extinction as a whetstone for their own DNA. Actually, it's 5, Soren said, his voice dropping into a register that made the floor tiles vibrate. 5 times the planet tried to wipe the board clean. Up to 90% of everything died each time. We're just the stuff that crawled back out of the ash. The system couldn't map it. The trade protocols immediately locked down the chamber, sensing the presence of a species that didn't follow the laws of evolutionary grace. I realized then that my blind spot was absolute. I had looked for a survivor of a catastrophe, but Soren was the product of a forge. Humans weren't a lucky accident. They were the refined, hardened steel of a world that had spent 4 billion years trying to kill them and failing. The red light of the administrative lockdown turned the chamber into the belly of a furnace. Soren sat back in his chair, his broad shoulders relaxed while the High Council sirens wailed in the corridors. He didn't look like a diplomat anymore. He looked like the iron he worked, heavy, quiet, and impossible to break without a fire hot enough to melt a sun. Soren placed the remains of the apple on the polished table. 5 black seeds sat inside the translucent core. The iron knife slid back into its leather sheath with a dry hiss. Red light glinted off the wet, dark pips on the obsidian. Soren closed his hand into a fist and stood up.